Hello everyone, Anup Bokil here. I have been getting lots of messages from my friends since long time to show them how I post process my images. So here is an attempt of recording a tutorial. I have decided to post process a mountain landscape image which I shot recently. Hope it is useful to you, and do let me know if you want to see any such videos in near future and any specific techniques if you want to see, do let me know. I want to talk about how I captured this image, what was my thought process behind capturing this image. So first of all, this image is shot with the help of 24 105mm lens at 29mm. So there were a few distractions, that's why I slightly zoomed in and shot it at 29mm. Aperture was f11, 1/320th of a second shutter speed, and ISO 100. So I wanted to get light on this mountain, so this was my focal point in this image. Because this image was shot with the help of 24 105 lens and shot slightly on the wider side, this mountain range is looking slightly compressed from the top. So what we can do is, we want to enhance this light, we want to recover some of the details from these shadows. We also want to accentuate these clouds. This is a beautiful texture that day we got in clouds. So I want to focus on bringing out some details in these clouds. So I'm gonna start with bringing up the exposure slightly, so that I'm actually focusing here on the foreground, and I'm not focusing on the sky. Even if this is blown out, I can recover this. So I'm gonna bring down the highlights to recover some overbright details here. I'm gonna push the whites up to enhance this light on the foreground. I'm not worrying about these blown out details in the sky. I'm gonna bring the highlights down even more. If you press Alt key, by the way, press and hold, you can see which areas are blown out in your image. I'm pulling down the shadows slightly because I don't want to draw viewers' attention in these shadow areas. I want my viewers to focus on this mountain and this foreground where the light is hitting. I'm gonna bring up contrast slightly. I'm also going to bring up the vibrance. I don't use saturation slider much because this is quite an aggressive slider, and it enhances all the colors. It doesn't just analyze which colors are already saturated and which not. So I use vibrance slider here, and I'm gonna bring up the temperature slider and make this image slightly on the warmer side, because I feel the image was slightly on the bluer side. I don't need to mess around with this tint slider. Now my next step is, I'm going to launch a linear gradient. You can press G key as a shortcut key, or you can go to this menu and launch linear gradient. I'm gonna drag it from top. If you hold the shift key, by the way, you get this straight linear gradient. If you don't hold the shift key, you can rotate your gradient in any direction. So now I'm going to bring down the exposure to recover those overbright details. I'm gonna pull my highlights down slightly as well, and I'm gonna try and push whites up to give those clouds a slight kick. I'm gonna bring the highlights even more, and I'm going to pull the exposure slider down. I don't want these details to blow out, so I'm gonna try and slightly increase the exposure because I felt the clouds were getting too muddy. This is okay. So now I'm gonna go and try dehaze slider to pull some of the details. I'm not gonna touch clarity and texture slider here. I will show you alternate method which is better and which gives better control in bringing out the details in cloud area. So I'm going to go to basic tab again and tweak this image even more. So I guess that is it in Camera Raw. I don't need to touch any other sliders. Now I'm going to go and open this image in Photoshop. I feel this image is slightly tilted, so I'm gonna launch the crop tool and rotate it tiny bit. I'm gonna crop it slightly. I also want to crop this image even more to put this area out of the image, because this area is not contributing much in the composition, and I'm gonna drag it slightly up from the bottom as well. Now what I want to do is I want to enhance this light even more. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna launch levels panel here, and I'm gonna bring up my highlight significantly to bring out this texture or the bring up this light, and I'm gonna pull midtones down to create more contrast between the shadows and highlights. And I don't want to affect the sky here, so I'm going to launch here a gradient tool, and this time I'm gonna drag it from because my foreground color is black and background color is white. I'm gonna drag it from the top, so that I am only affecting the foreground and not affecting the sky. If I feel this is too bright, so I can always bring down the opacity to control the effect. So what I'm gonna do next is, this corner is really very bright, and this is drawing viewers attention out of the frame. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna launch another levels panel and bring down these whites. If you bring this up, you are gonna make your image very bright, and if you are bringing this slider towards black, you are gonna dial your exposure down. So I guess this is okay, and we are revealing everything that we applied in this mask. So I'm going to press Ctrl I on a PC or Command I on a Mac to invert the mask, and I'm gonna paint this area with white brush now. So you can select brush tool here, or you can press B key on your keyboard to launch brush tool. Make sure opacity and flow is at 100. I'm gonna paint this area so that viewers don't get distracted by the overexposure. I'm reducing my opacity slightly to control the effect. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to enhance the texture in the clouds even more. So I'm gonna show you one technique which is known as cloud sculpting. I'm gonna create a new layer here and set the blending mode to soft light, and I'm going to launch brush tool here. Make sure the foreground color is white, and with the help of very low opacity here, I'm going to try with 10%. I'm going to paint on these white clouds here to make them slightly brighter. Just make sure you are not blowing out the highlights. Don't overpaint on already bright clouds. And now I'm gonna switch the foreground color to black and paint on these already dark clouds. I'm also going to reduce the opacity to maybe 5% because it was too strong, I feel. I'm just freehand painting on these clouds. I'm not using any selection method here. This way we can pull out so much texture in clouds. So if I toggle the visibility on and off, you can clearly see we have brought out some more texture in the clouds. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna still enhance the light on this foreground even more by launching selective color panel, and this is the best way or natural way to enhance saturation instead of going to use saturation slider and increase saturation. So I'm going to target this yellow channel because there are lots of yellows or greens here in the foreground. I'm going to bring up the yellows to bring up some saturation. I'm gonna bring down the magentas because it was getting too warm, I feel. When you are bringing down the magentas, that means you are adding greens, because green is the opposite of magenta on digital color wheel. I'm gonna bring down the cyans to inject some reds here. I'm gonna go to greens and I'm gonna bring down the magenta to add some greens. I'm gonna increase yellows, and now if I toggle visibility on and off, I can clearly see I have enhanced colors of the foreground. I can also enhance some reds here because there are fields I can see which are getting some light. So I'm gonna bring down the cyans to inject some reds. So I guess that's all I wanted to achieve with selective color. And now I'm gonna delete this mask and I'm gonna show you how I can target only these highlights. I don't want to affect this saturation adjustment to shadow area. So I'm gonna go to select color range and I'm going to target only highlights here. I'm gonna bring up range to 255 and now I'm going to increase fuzziness to target only these highlights, and I'm not affecting shadow. Areas which are black or which are very dark are not gonna receive much adjustment, and areas which are already bright or white here are going to receive that saturation adjustment. I'm gonna hit OK. I'm going to click on this button to add mask. So if I now toggle the visibility on and off, I can clearly see the adjustment is going only into the highlights area and not into the shadows. So I want to enhance this brightness furthermore. So I'm going to go to levels panel and bring up these highlights even more and bring midtones down to create some contrast in the foreground. I don't want to crush these details in the shadow area. So this looks okay to me. So to control the adjustment, I'm going to go to gradient tool, make sure my foreground color is white here, and I'm gonna drag it from the bottom because I only want to affect the foreground and not these clouds. See? Now what I can do is I'm gonna add that soft glowy moody effect in the image that just blends these highlights and shadows a little more and softens the texture out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna first create a stamped layer by pressing Ctrl Shift Alt and E, or if you are on a Mac it's Command Option Shift and E. So this creates a stamped layer. It is nothing but the current state of our image on a separate pixel layer. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this layer by hitting Ctrl Z or Command Z on a Mac and go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter. I'm gonna slightly warm this image up and inject tiny bit of magenta. Don't worry about how the image is looking right now. I'm gonna bring the highlights down. I'm gonna increase the contrast slightly. I'm gonna bring the exposure up. And I'm gonna add quite a lot of vibrance. I know this is looking slightly crap right now, but I will show you how to control this. And I'm also going to blur this layer. So I'm gonna go to Filter, Blur and Gaussian Blur, and make sure you are dialing in the radius about number of megapixels of your camera. So I shot this on Sony A7-III, which is I guess 24 megapixel camera. So I'm gonna put here, say about 25 was looking right here. So I'm gonna dial 25 and hit OK. And now I'm going to dial the opacity down to maybe 10%. See, now the effect is looking really cool. And if you press this on and off, you can clearly see we have softened the texture in our image, and also we have added that soft warmth in our highlights. And if I'm gonna slightly increase here the opacity to maybe 12%, and now I only want to apply this effect in my highlights. So what I'm gonna do is to take this effect away from my shadow area. I'm gonna double click here on this layer, go to blending options, and in the underlying layer I will show you one more trick here. So if you click to color overlay and set the color to magenta and go to blending options, you can clearly see where your effect is being applied. So I'm gonna drag this slider from shadows. So now I can clearly see the areas which are in shadows are getting protected from this adjustment, and only this range, I mean these highlights, are getting affected. To soften or to add some feather in our selection, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna press the Alt key or Option key and click on this handle to break this into two, and then I'm gonna drag this slightly here to add more feather into our selection, and I'm gonna uncheck this color overlay and hit OK. So now this effect is only going in our highlights and not in shadows. And there is one more thing I want to do. I will merge all these layers into the background layer by hitting Ctrl Shift E or Command Shift E on a Mac, and I am going to select the entire image by pressing Ctrl A and Ctrl T to free transform, and I'm gonna right click here on this image and click Distort. Because this was shot with the help of wide angle lens and looking compressed slightly, I'm gonna drag this image slightly above to make these mountains slightly daunting, and hit OK. Make sure you hit Ctrl D to deselect the image. I like mountains in my image to look dominating or daunting. Mountains can never look compressed. It just doesn't look good. So I guess this is it in this image editing. And do let me know how did you like it and what you want to see next. I'm gonna try and record such tutorials. If you want to learn any specific techniques, do let me know in the comment section. Thank you for watching.